Hello friends, good to see you again on DD India. I'm your host Munmun Bhattacharya. Today we are in conversation with yet another representative of a G20 member state in India. Sarah Storey is Australian Chargé d'Affaires in India. Australia matters to India also as a comprehensive strategic partner and a Quad partner. We will speak to her about India's G20 presidency, about India and the Australia-India partnership. Welcome Ms. Storey to DD India. Namaste.
Namaste.
It's good to see you in a traditional Indian attire. You wear that often?
Oh, I love to. And just yesterday we celebrated National Handloom Day with a wonderful procession with many of us wearing traditional attire.
Lovely. So the first thing that comes to mind whenever I meet an Australian diplomat is how PM Anthony Albanese welcomed Prime Minister Narendra Modi into the Sydney Stadium, saying PM Modi is the boss, quote unquote, and that the kind of rapturous welcome that he got there beat the one that Bruce Springsteen, the American star, got. Is that the kind of camaraderie and that spirit that really binds India and Australia in G20 meetings in India?
Absolutely. You really nailed it, Munmun. The warmth was very palpable, but so was the excitement. I don't think that Kudos Stadium had ever seen anything quite like it. It was really just a buzz with the warmth, and I think the crowd simply celebrated being Indian on the occasion of the Prime Minister's auspicious visit. It was just such a wonderful visit and really showed the depth of the warmth between our leaders.
Right. What is your assessment of India's G20 presidency this year?
Well, Munmun, I think our assessment is it's done very well so far. Australia has said from the outset that we strongly support India's G20 presidency. We strongly support its central coordinating vision, and we are very dedicated to making sure that it achieves a successful outcome.
How do you look at the efforts that India is making to forge consensus on all issues of development that affect everyone around the world, even though there are some divisions on the Russia-Ukraine war?
When our development minister, Minister Conroy, when he was in Varanasi in June for the development ministers meeting, he noted that we are very committed to seeing the development elements of the G20 come forward. Foreign Minister Wong herself, when she was in Delhi in March for the foreign ministers meeting, she noted the compounding crises of food and energy security and gender inequality, as well as climate change. And she said these are exactly the sorts of issues that must be considered by the G20. And Minister Conroy followed her by saying that in terms of development challenges faced by the world, that we actually must have collective action. So the G20 is a perfect forum in which to pursue those. And just today, in fact, we have announced a new development policy, and it is 9,100 crore over the next 5 years. That's in addition to our already record-breaking development assistance. And it is seeking to make the world a much better place and to pursue the sustainable development goals most assuredly. In relation to the divisions you noted between the countries, it will come as no surprise to your viewers that our Prime Minister, as well as many of our ministers, have said multiple times that we abhor and we do not support in any way Russia's illegal invasion of the Ukraine. We consider it to be fundamentally counter to international law and the United Nations Charter. And certainly, not only are we concerned about the violence and devastation that's been wrought in Ukraine itself, but the crisis has spurred quite a few and compounded existing crises around food and energy security, which actually makes it much more challenging for forums such as the G20 to solve these problems.
We'll come to that one by one, but before that, is Australia contributing to consensus building for a Delhi declaration?
Absolutely, Munmun. We remain in very close contact throughout all of India's many G20 meetings. We've been very closely engaged from a very senior level, and we've had so far 5 Australian ministers have attended 7 G20 meetings, so 2 of them have attended 2, and we've got another 2 different ministers coming in coming weeks ahead of the G20 summit. Of course, our Prime Minister will be here. Our Prime Minister has said on multiple occasions that he strongly supports India's G20 presidency. So part of that is, of course, working towards consensus building and outcomes. Our Sherpas track is also closely engaged in negotiating the details of the consensus.
How does Australia see the way Prime Minister Narendra Modi is providing leadership to the G20 this year?
Well, his leadership is very strong, I would say. He has, first of all, dedicated a very clear vision and organising principle around one Earth, one family, one future. This really underpins the development and climate challenges that are fundamental throughout the world, whether or not to G20 partner nations, but also beyond those nations. And so we have very much been struck by Prime Minister Modi ji's very inclusive leadership in terms of the G20 and how it is running its agenda. We're noticing, for instance, the inclusion of a number of international institutions and guest countries being able to observe. India is also engaging through the multilateral fora and a number of other traditional partnerships, including Global South, which, as we saw when Prime Minister Modi attended FIPIC, the Forum for India-Pacific Island Countries, right in our backyard in Papua New Guinea in May, just before that wonderful welcome at Kudos Stadium in Sydney. He's very committed to engaging with the Global South, and I think that's a quality of leadership that really makes India's presidency stand out.
The fallout of the war is also impacting the Global South the most, and one of the challenges that you also mentioned is lack of energy security facing the world today. It was interesting to see Australia announcing up to $50 million in funding as its contribution to the Quad for development of clean energy supply chains in the Indo-Pacific at the Energy Transitions meeting in Goa of the G20. What is that one initiative, if I may ask you, that Australia is most excited about out of a bouquet of initiatives that India is piloting under G20?
In terms of India's piloting under the G20, I would actually turn initially to, you mentioned the announcement made by our minister. So Minister Chris Bowen, when he was here for a couple of G20 meetings, at the Energy Ministers meeting, you're quite right, he announced a $50 million package in terms of supporting the energy transition and energy security in the Indo-Pacific. This is something we strongly welcome because it is also through Australia's and India's partnership that we are working together on diversifying supply chains. So what we are already seeing through the Australia-India bilateral relationship is also what we are seeing reflected in India's initiatives under the G20. For instance, under our own comprehensive strategic partnership with India, we're very fortunate to have a solar task force and a green hydrogen task force. We are also working towards elevating our relationship to a full formal partnership on energy diversification and supply. So Australian companies are already coming into India and working. So I have 2 examples that I recently engaged with Minister Bowen when he came through Delhi on his way out of the Energy Ministers meeting. We had 5G, and 5G is a company that is looking at deploying very complicated solar infrastructure to enable very large-scale deployment of solar energy, which will make it affordable for Indian consumers. And secondly, we have another Australian company called Power Ledger. It uses Bitcoin and financial technology in order to do tracing, trading of energy. And this is a way that in real time, energy can be shifted around because, as we all know, as we are moving towards diversification of our energy supply. A huge challenge is on storage, so being able to use that and send the energy out to the grid is something that at scale India can really embrace. So I think that India's leadership in terms of energy diversification and supply is something that has been very much on display during the G20.
So what do you pick then out of India's bouquet of G20 initiatives? Is it the Innovation Centre for Green Hydrogen, or is it some other initiative?
It would be hard to pick one, I think, Munmun. I think that I'm just a fan of so many of them, ranging from, I think, the energy diversification and supply. We all know that India is a tech powerhouse and is enormous talent factory, essentially. The scale is something that not many other nations can bring to the table. So India's ingenuity and its ability to really have a very competitive and thriving startup culture, I think has been a real mark of India's success under the G20, because we all know the startup initiative is one of India's pride and joys, and it's doing tremendously well. But I personally am also a very strong fan of women's empowerment, and I think that this has also been very successful under India's leadership.
So taking off from there, as a lady diplomat, how do you see the way India is promoting the cause of women-led development under its presidency?
Yes, it's a very key element of the SDGs. We very much support it. So at the recent Women's Empowerment meeting, we actually had Australia's Ambassador for Gender Equality attend. This is a very unique position and reflects Australia's determination to engage in whatever forum we can to promote gender equality, because we all know that gender equality is not just a woman's issue. It makes sense. It makes sense for security, for resilience, or economic resilience and empowerment and development. It makes sense for stability. And so it makes sense for the whole economy, not just for women. So we very much support India's focus on a women-led development initiative. And we were very struck, for instance, at the empowerment meeting. One of my colleagues was fortunate to attend, and she noted in particular India's drive for digital inclusion. Now, this is a form of development that really benefits everyday Indians. And I think that we've seen remarkable strides in the last decade or so in terms of India's delivery of services via digital mediums. And this is something that has really, in particular, reached and resonated with women.
Another challenge before the world is a lack of food security. India has gone all out to promote millets during its presidency. You must have met a lot of your colleagues and senior officials of Australia who've attended so many meetings. They must have snacked on several millet delicacies. How do you look at how India is going all out in this?
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate India for its success in the Food and Agriculture Organization, a United Nations organ, to denote 2023, the International Year of the Millets. This is a great achievement and fundamental to India's goal for the G20, because in relation to food security, Australia well knows that millets are highly nutritious, but they are also able to be produced in drought conditions. And so in terms of climate and the intersecting values for trying to create, to improve food security and also improve climate outcomes, this is a wonderful crop and a wonderful product. So many Australian delegates have rejoiced in all of the different versions of millets that we have been served. In the office, for instance, we also often share millet cookies because we know that they are a way to keep us going through a long day. But Australia is no stranger to millets, in fact. Australia's First Nations people, particularly those in low rainfall areas, traditionally harvested millets themselves. So this is something that we are very excited about and so very much support India's promotion of the International Year of the Millets and as a very real solution for food and energy and climate.
Under the Culture Working Group, India would like all G20 member states to become signatories to the 1970 UNESCO Convention that requires all the signatories to voluntarily return cultural artifacts to the country of origin, especially those that have been taken away by colonial plunder, theft, smuggling, etc. Australia and India have seen some sort of movement on that. Australia has returned quite a few cultural artifacts to India in the past. Do you support this initiative of India?
Absolutely. It's a very important initiative, Munmun. Australia has done the work on this. We actually ratified this UNESCO convention in 1989, and our implementing legislation is decades old, so very well established in our legal system. We also have done the work in relation to returning over 40 artefacts in the past 10 years to India, and last year there were nearly 30 of those, and they were actually examined and welcomed by Prime Minister Modi ji, which was a very nice touch. Back in 2014 we also returned a very substantial and significant bronze Shiva and a very antique stone idol. We consider that the theft of or the retention of important cultural objects to be something that is very worthy of collective action. Our Minister for the Arts, Minister Burke, his line on this is very clear, that where Australians have had these things taken from us, we will support their return. Where we are the ones holding the objects when we ought not to be, we must assist in the return of those objects. So we work very closely with a range of international organisations, whether it be Interpol to prevent illicit trafficking, whether it be UNESCO to create greater standards and enforcement of these, or the World Customs Organisation. I think through cross-cutting efforts, we can work to make sure that these objects are returned to their rightful homes.
Australia has seen catastrophic bushfires in the past. How do you look at India's initiative wherein India is pushing for restoration of lands degraded particularly by forest fires?
Yes, indeed. We have suffered some extreme climate events, certainly in Australia, including some very catastrophic bushfires, the number of which are increasing in frequency and certainly, unfortunately, reducing in the duration between them. So we're seeing these much more often. We are seeing extreme climate events around the world. So we very much support India's initiative to seek to have restoration for impacted lands. So this is something that we take forward very, very closely. There have been a number of commissions of inquiry, for instance, in Australia that looks into how best to restore the lands impacted.
It's quite interesting that India and Australia already now have a mechanism for mutual recognition of educational qualifications. India would like that to be the case under the G20 ambit as well at a multilateral level, and besides that, India would also like mutual recognition of skills. Do you support that initiative?
I think so, but I think it might be one of the more challenging ones to achieve, Munmun. I think that Prime Minister Modi ji has a very clear aim, I think, to promote the ability of India's remarkable wells of talent, its youth, the demographic dividend that everyone speaks of very commonly here. We want to take part and partner with India to actually celebrate and provide options for India's young people. That's why bilaterally we have settled on a mobility and migration partnership agreement that will actually allow Indians to travel to Australia for mobility opportunities. Already we've seen the international student cohort from India return with a force, a fantastic force, and we're very pleased with that. But Australia already offers the most attractive post-study work rights to Indian students, I think, compared to any destination. So it's very natural to see, particularly with the growth of diaspora populations overseas, and I would note there that Australia's India diaspora population now numbers nearly 3.8%, nearly 1 million Australians. That might not sound like a lot by Indian standards, but considering we're only 26 million, that's a lot. And it's growing by the day. We certainly value their inclusion and their contribution to Australian society. So it's only natural, I think, that Prime Minister would look to create the beginning of all of these potential pathways through multiple G20 economies, because he has quite rightly said the world is India's workplace. So we support that. It might take longer to achieve that one, but I think that laying the groundwork there is, we don't have to achieve everything all in this 1 year. There are ongoing efforts that we'll see.
What is Australia's wish list then from the Delhi Declaration?
Oh, from the Delhi Declaration, we just would like to see the G20 be the most effective body that it can be, because it is fundamentally important. It is not the G7 because it is a body that has on board emerging economies, and for that there can be no international economic entity such as the G20 which does not take into account the voice of rising powers such as India. And so we want to see a Delhi Declaration that takes account of India's priorities for the G20 presidency and achieves consensus where possible.
And what appeals to you the most about India's presidency? Because there is so much color in this presidency. There is a representation of every Indian state. There are meetings being held around the country. It's like a celebration of India. And here you are wearing an Indian attire, and you love to wear sari as well.
Absolutely, I love it. I think that this is a mark of India's presidency, and it's been a hallmark of its success to date. It's clear that the logistics and thought that have gone into the preparation for these meetings around over 50 cities within India have really showcased the diversity and the vibrancy of India's democracy and India's culture. India is clearly a civilizational power, and it is wonderful to see that on display and celebrated. We know from direct feedback from our ministers and senior officials alike that they have very much appreciated the themes and the attention to detail of India's presidency, including the celebration of the diversity of India's culture. And without doubt, it has been remarkably colourful.
Prime Minister Modi says about the India-Australia relationship that it is in T20 mode, which means that a lot is happening in less time. So what is your priority number one for this relationship?
Munmun, I could not put it down to one priority, and I think that in fact is the T20 analogy is a very accurate one, because we all know that in T20 the play is fast, the play is hard, but it's not difficult. It's fun and it's very energetic. We are working on so many levels across so many priorities. We are very fortunate that since the elevation of our relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2020, across the board we have seen many initiatives flourish, but the work is not done. We have so much more that we need to do. We are translating, for instance, one of India's first free trade agreements, our initial economic cooperation and trade agreement. We're looking to convert those to deepen the market access that benefits both of our complementary economies through a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. We are looking to diversify, as I mentioned, our efforts to create greater energy security. We are working on women's empowerment. We are particularly looking to deepen our defence and national security cooperation. So you may have noticed, for instance, that Prime Minister Albanese was fortunate enough to be the first international leader invited aboard the INS Vikrant, India's first indigenously commissioned and produced aircraft carrier. We see so much potential for cooperation with India in this space to make the Indo-Pacific a much more secure, resilient and prosperous region for the benefit of all, where no country dominates and no one country is dominated.
Strategic trust is a must for any strategic partnership. India has taken up with Australia its concerns regarding the activities of pro-Khalistan elements in Australia. We know that the Indian diplomats posted there have been threatened. Indians have been attacked. The honorary Indian consulate in Brisbane has been targeted. There was an instance where some Sikh Australian soldiers were spotted at a pro-Khalistan event. How is Australia addressing these concerns?
Well, first and foremost, Munmun, we take these developments very seriously. Just this morning, I was participating in a virtual call convened by our Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet with all of the relevant officials across the federal government. So behind the scenes, there's an awful lot going on that may not be immediately apparent to your viewers. We understand that this separatist movement is perhaps growing in intensity and escalating its tactics. But we are monitoring very closely, and we remain in very, very close cooperation and communication with the Government of India, with the Indian diplomatic and consular personnel in Australia, because we fundamentally support and take very seriously our obligations under the Vienna Convention for the protection of diplomatic and consular personnel. At the same time, Munmun, we have a democracy like India's where the ability to protest is one of our freedoms. And so we have a very fine balance there in making sure that Australians have the right to protest peacefully, but that this would never be tolerated to spill over into violence, into any kind of actions such as that. So our law enforcement agencies are tackling this very carefully and closely. They are coordinating well, and as our Prime Minister has said publicly, as well as a number of our ministers, we support India's sovereignty 100%. And so any processes have no effect in our eyes.
On the Indo-Pacific, you've spelled out Australia's stance. It's interesting that Australia is hosting the Malabar exercise for the first time. And it also reminds me of what Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said, that India is at the center of Australia's approach to the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Is this one area where we are going to see a lot of activity going forward?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, Munmun, I think that deepening our defence cooperation is only natural. It's something that our Prime Ministers have agreed is a priority for the relationship. Defence Minister Miles, who is also our Deputy Prime Minister, he was the first member of this government to visit India within a month of taking office. So I see the defence relationship as really taking hold. I think that exercise Malabar, and for that I would say we are certainly very grateful for the opportunity to host. This has been a long-standing exercise, and Australia is delighted to be hosting off the waters of Sydney. So I think that this is an exercise where we are seeing, as we are with a number of other bilateral and multilateral defence exercises, seeing an increase in the number, but most importantly, the complexity of the defence exercises. We are working towards greater interoperability, which is a key pillar and key tenet of making the Indo-Pacific a safer and more resilient region.
Ms. Storey, we look forward to welcoming Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to Delhi for the Leaders Summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Munmun.